Good morning, comrades. It is Sunday, lazy Sunday. What's going on? Well, yeah, it's that kind of day. It's kind of that kind of day. We're gonna watch a couple videos today, I think. I got a couple that came out over the weekend, and I wanted to check them out. But before we do that, make sure that you check out our appearance on the Valley Labor Report yesterday. You can check our VOD, I think, because they've been going for about 46 hours at this point. Like, I think after like 3 hours, they start deleting like VOD. They just like the longest video that can be is like 3 hours long. So it just starts like cutting out time. But they had us on there yesterday for about 30 minutes. It was pretty cool. We talked about stealing from the boss and other cool things. Definitely check that out. You can check our VOD on yesterday's show. You can also check us on Twitch and all the other stuff. Twitch, YouTube. You know where to find us. Why am I so blurry? Stop being so blurry. Stop it. I'm not in the mood for this. All right. That's better, but it's shittier camera. All right. That's not as blurry. I don't know what's up with this camera, dude. What is up with this camera, dude? All right. Let me put my lights on. I already sent out the tweet. All right. There we go. It's so bright. Why are you so bright all the time? Why don't you start like a little less bright? There we go. All right, folks. So today we have, I thought that was a new second thought that I wanted to watch. Maybe we can start there. And kind of just move on from there. Move on from that point. But yeah. Capitalism really innovate? I think I know the answer to this one. But let's watch the video and find out.
By Curiosity Stream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for Curiosity. We live in a world dominated by the economic system known as capitalism. Private ownership of the means of production is the norm, giant multinational corporations have a greater GDP than entire countries, and we're currently witnessing the birth of a second Gilded Age, complete with modern-day robber barons and skyrocketing inequality and poverty. For the first time in 100 years, the United States is seeing a real resurgence in class consciousness and criticism of the status quo. We've seen record numbers of protests and rallies, low-wage workers are walking out and demanding better conditions, and the language of class struggle is finally beginning to seep back into the American consciousness. It would be absurd to look around and assert that everything is fine, that capitalism is providing a good life and opportunities for the average person, when every quality of life metric is in decline for everyone except the top few percent. And yet, as always, there are those who are unwilling to acknowledge the reality of the situation, and instead fall back on ignorant or bad faith arguments to defend a failing economic system. In this episode, we're going to look at one argument in particular, the claim that without capitalism, there would be no innovation. Let's start with the assertion itself. Without capitalism, there would be no innovation.
All right. So this is the one that gets rolled out probably more than any that I see. Like the idea that like the source of all innovation, the reason that we have, you know, modern science, for example, or a modern space program, or things like that. The fact that Amazon is able to distribute anything to anywhere in the world, or anywhere in the United States at least, in 2 days, which isn't even necessarily true. Like they're not all they don't always nail that. But okay, let's go. Let's take a look.
What does this imply? It suggests that the sole motivating factor for anyone to do anything is money, the profit motive. It suggests that the only reason society has advanced is because of capitalism. This is quite the claim.
To suggest that society had never advanced prior to capitalism is already a mistake. I mean, society has been developing in many different ways over time. And now, I do admit, and even Marx would admit this, that capitalism has allowed for a certain amount of innovation prior to the previous system, which was, feudalism. In parts of America, it was like chattel slavery. I mean, in the South of America specifically, and parts of South and South America as well. So, okay.
Claim, and as we'll see shortly, it is incorrect in both regards. Let's start with the first point, the profit motive as the motivating factor. Once upon a time, people produced food not to sell, but to consume themselves and stockpile for the future. No money exchanged hands, the end. Of course, this is an overly simplistic argument. But people who make claims about the efficacy of the profit motive should remember that capitalism is a fairly recent development in the grand scheme of things. But leaving thousands of years of human history aside, even in the modern capitalist era, there have been countless examples of people choosing to innovate not because they lusted after money, but because it was the right thing to do. One of the more well-known examples is Jonas Salk. Though it was declared eradicated in the Americas in 1994, polio was once a major threat to children around the world. Polio is an infectious disease that attacks the central nervous system and often leads to paralysis. During the first half of the 20th century, what began as localized polio outbreaks had reached epidemic levels in North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And in 1952, the US faced the worst outbreak it had ever experienced, infecting at least 58,000 people, killing 3,145, and leaving over 21,000 more with varying degrees of paralysis in a single year. Some of the worst affected could no longer breathe by themselves, and needed to be placed in what was called an iron lung. This horrible disease brought unspeakable suffering to children around the world. But thanks to a team of innovative scientists led by Dr. Jonas Salk, today, polio is little more than a bad memory. Starting in 1948, Dr. Salk dedicated the next 7 years of his life to understanding how polio worked and how we could fight it. In 1955, when the news of Salk's new and effective vaccine was made public, he was hailed as a hero and a miracle worker. Salk became a household name. He could have taken advantage of this newfound fame and made a fortune on the vaccine, but he refused to patent his creation.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Well,
I think I know where Second Thought's going to be going with this. We talked a little bit about this with, we talked about this generally on this show, and specifically with Rob Larson. But since we're on the topic of vaccines, I am thinking we're going to go into the international distribution of the COVID vaccine and how Bill Gates has been blocking that off, but we'll see. But yeah, it is true that in the polio situation, Jonas Salk did not patent the vaccine, which means that he did not essentially control production of that vaccine. He allowed other people, other companies to produce it, which makes it much easier to distribute more broadly, which is a good thing because more people have access to it if you can do that. And that is a not capitalist approach, because if you were incentivized to do the profit motive, which is the only reason, according to capitalists, that anyone does anything, if you were to do the profit motive as your approach, then you would never ever do that, ever.
People, I would say there is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
Jonas Salk chose not to patent the vaccine in order to maximize its availability around the world. By 1959, 90 countries were making use of the polio vaccine, and by 1994, the disease had been completely eradicated in North America. When people first learn about Jonas Salk, many of them are shocked that he chose not to profit from his creation. It's an understandable reaction when the norm in the pharmaceutical industry is criminal price gouging, where executives rake in tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars every year. But if people like Jonas Salk can exist in even the most lucrative fields, then the profit motive is not the only motivating factor that exists. And this is only one example. If you look around, you'll find many more. Those who benefit from capitalist exploitation will try to convince you that people won't be motivated to improve the world without a financial incentive. But that's just not the case. But enough about this first point. Let's move on to the second one, the claim that society has only advanced because of the profit motive. Capitalist apologists have a tendency to view the private sector as some godlike entity that operates with 100% efficiency, is the sole driver of innovation, and always acts in the best interest of the people. This is rarely, if ever, the case. In fact, the private sector hardly ever drives innovation at all. Take the iPhone, for example. Fans of capitalism love to say things like, you tweet about socialism from your iPhone, but you wouldn't have that iPhone without capitalism. That's a little disingenuous, to say the least. If you look at the iPhone, or just about any modern phone really, you'll see that very nearly every critical part was developed with public funding. Microchips, GPS, accelerometers, image sensors, touchscreens. These were all projects funded by the public, either via the government or the military.
The entire internet is a development project by, in part by the U.S. government, space program as well. These are not capitalist endeavors necessarily. This is essentially just a privatization of public technology and research. It's just being purchased and snapped up. You could have an internet without capitalism. You can have it. I mean, the Russians did it. They had a space program without capitalism, and you could have an iPhone without capitalism. The idea that Steve Jobs or whatever, or Bill Gates are responsible for technology that we currently have today for that level of current technology is laughable. They're just salesmen. They're salesmen, and they're strategists behind the scenes. And as we talked about with Rob Larson, like I said before, in an older episode, on his first appearance on the show, Steve Jobs was not even good at that.
And it's not just phone components. Nearly every aspect of modern-day life was funded and created not by the private sector, but by the public sector. Satellites, the internet, public schools, national parks, waste management, water infrastructure. Things we rely on and take for granted today are the result not of this supposed capitalist innovation, but of public programs. The private sector rarely drives innovation. Even the internet's favorite faux futurist, Elon Musk, is only able to pursue his vanity projects because of billions of...
I don't know if y'all watched Elon Musk on Saturday Night Live. I watched it. I watched like almost all of it. And it was impossibly cringe. I could not believe how terrible it was. Like, the guy has zero charisma. He dressed up as Wario and made anti-Italian discrimination jokes, and they still didn't work. That's how bad it was. It's ridiculous. How do you not make an anti-Italian discrimination joke work? And how do you make like Wario not funny? That is just that's the easiest like meme comedy that you could possibly do, and he fucked it up. Incredible. Like that's the most impressive thing about Elon Musk, I think, that he somehow ruined Wario.
Public programs. The private sector rarely drives innovation. Even the internet's favorite faux futurist, Elon Musk, is only able to pursue his vanity projects because of billions of dollars of government funding. Okay, so if capitalism isn't driven by innovation, what is the driving factor? It's pretty simple, really. Capitalism is driven by the profit motive, not by some innate drive to innovate. If something is profitable, it will be produced, which leads to the proliferation of cheap, useless garbage like 30 different kinds of poop emoji pool floats and tens of thousands of copycat phone cases. If we take the pharmaceutical industry again, instead of prioritizing new, critically important medicine, the profit motive incentivizes the production of slight variations of existing drugs in order to extend their patents. In this way, capitalism actually prevents innovation by demanding that funding be allocated towards the most profitable ventures, not the ones that will do the most good or drive humanity forward. But this isn't the case everywhere. If we take a country like Cuba, where healthcare is nationalized, we see a completely different approach. Since they're not beholden to the profit motive, Cuba has made astounding medical advances even with a drastically lower GDP than the US. Not to mention decades of...
And not to mention this too, like when the US talks about Cuba, I remember this last year, like Bernie Sanders in like I can't remember what month it was, brought this up, the fact that Cuba's got medical advances because of their national healthcare system that the U.S. doesn't have. And he basically got like dogpiled for that, for stating a fact and essentially being called like an apologist for like Castro or whatever, which, I mean, it totally took any and all focus on what he was talking about and just made it about, oh wow, we have basically made it, we decontextualized and boiled down the entirety of Cuba into one former leader who's dead now, and basically made it like whether or not you even support like a part of what they do as a country or part of the way of life that they have, like, period, and make that a referendum on whether or not you like Castro. And that's not even like I'm not trying to say like, oh, Castro good or Castro bad in this necessarily, and even in this situation, I mean, like that just like what they've taken is a comment about healthcare, about the healthcare system in Cuba, and turned it into Bernie Sanders supports the leader of this country or whatever. It was so incredibly stupid. So incredibly stupid. Like, it's unbelievable. Unbelievably stupid.
Approach. Since they're not beholden to the profit motive, Cuba has made astounding medical advances even with a drastically lower GDP than the US, not to mention decades of crippling US sanctions. Cuban doctors are renowned the world over, and during the pandemic, they not only easily handled their own outbreak, they also sent their doctors and medical supplies to countries who needed them most, all without the expectation of any kind of profit. Again,
cool
capitalism will not produce results unless there is a profit to be made.
The US would never do this unless they can make some money off of it. And another, that's good and cool that there's the idea of international solidarity by Cuba to, end the pandemic by sending doctors abroad to address the issue. I mean, like, that's for no profit. That's great. That's awesome.
Kind of profit. Again, capitalism will not produce results unless there is a profit to be made. Because of this, hundreds of thousands of Americans continue to suffer, while countries like Cuba make accommodations for humanitarian crises, with no expectation of profit. But let's move on to something a little more current. I'm sure most of you have seen the viral pictures of these signs put up at fast food restaurants and other low-wage businesses. Workers have finally realized that they have some bargaining power, at least for the time being. If you're unfamiliar with the situation, here's a brief synopsis. Low-wage workers are quitting or not coming back to work because they can make more money on unemployment. This has led to a number of managers putting out signs saying that no one wants to work anymore and suggesting it's some kind of moral failing. Here's the thing. I don't know a single person who would want to work a low-wage, miserable fast food job. The idea that people would want to toil their life away dealing with awful customers and doing thankless work is absurd. This supposed American value of working for work's sake is a myth. It's nothing more than propaganda by those who own the businesses. Think about it. If you were offered the opportunity to not spend 10 hours a day slaving over a grill or staring blankly at spreadsheets and still make enough money to live, would you take it? Of course you would. You could spend that time doing work you actually enjoy, or finding a job that pays better. That's the thing capitalists never mention. Most humans do have an inclination to work. They just don't want to work for you. There's a difference between work, being productive with your time and skills, and the modern American conception of work. Tedious labor people are obligated to accept for fear of starvation and poverty.
Yeah, and another thing about work, before we get off of this topic, because he's jumping really quickly, like the sort of definition that is usually operative and unfortunately compelling to enough people, that sort of carries the day here, more often than not, is like whether or not you make money is the determining factor as to whether or not what you're doing is work, which is bullshit. I can go make a garden in my backyard. I can build the box. I can fill it with dirt. I can level it. I can plant the plants. I can put the mulch on there, and I can make that garden. That is work. I don't make a dime for that. I don't plan on making a dime for that. My backyard is nicer. I think that is in alignment with the quote unquote American value of work. wouldn't you say? But based off of the fact that you don't make money off of it, it is perceived as not so.
Poverty. Now, this trend of people refusing to work low-wage jobs is a prime opportunity for capitalists to innovate. They could come up with a way to make their jobs more enticing to would-be workers. Have they done that? No. In fact, they've already run to the government to beg them to fix their problem for them. And because all American administrations are increasingly corporatized, we've gotten this: a threat that if anyone refuses a job offer, no matter how demeaning, degrading, and miserable, no matter how low the wages, they will be kicked off unemployment. So much for at-will employment. Capitalists can't stand the thought of workers having any bargaining power. And so, like with everything, they demand help from the government. Capitalism doesn't innovate. It only pursues the next fistful of dollars. It asks, where is there a profit to be made? It never considers the use value of what it produces, only the profits it can make. And so we continue to receive mountains of cheap products that will fail.
It doesn't consider use value and only the profits. That's exactly right. Exactly right. It's exchange value instead of use value. And labor is just viewed as a minus on the spreadsheet.
Doesn't innovate. It only pursues the next fistful of dollars. It asks, where is there a profit to be made? It never considers the use value of what it produces.
Labor cost is viewed as a minus on the spreadsheet. The value of all of this stuff comes from labor. I just want to be 100% clear about that.
Only the profits it can make. And so we continue to receive mountains of cheap products that will fail in a few months. The profit motive is not the driver of innovation. It stifles innovation. It prevents funds from being used in a way that would actually benefit the world, instead funneling that money into pointless, often incredibly destructive projects. When there is innovation in America, it is in spite of capitalism, not because of it. It's because people like Jonas Salk realize that some things
I think that's a little bit too far. I think that, like, some levels of innovation, some things can be innovated through capitalism, but the things that are mostly innovated by it are bad, right? Like the idea of having, 69 different poop emoji pool floats is an innovation. Now, is that an innovation that's necessarily useful to society? No. The ability for Facebook to essentially have open season on all of your personal and private data. Is that an innovation? Yes. Is that a good innovation? Hell no. That's horrible. So, I mean, there are innovations that capitalism provides. They're just not good. Bill Gates innovated the marketing program of getting Windows on essentially all PCs, all IBM PCs. That's an innovation, right? It's a really innovating way to essentially saturate the market to the point where you have the only operating system that any computer can use. That's an innovation. Is it a good innovation? No, because we have to use this shitty fucking software. I mean, yeah, I guess what he's saying is that, like, good innovations, but I'm sort of being a little bit more value neutral about it, perhaps.
Are more important than
Maybe
profit.
I'm being pedantic.
The claim that there would be no innovation without capitalism is blatantly false. It's disproven by history, it's disproven by other countries, it's disproven by common sense, and more often, it's disproven by the behavior and actions of the capitalists themselves. If we really care about innovation, we need to dismantle capitalism and throw the profit motive in the trash where it belongs.
Throw it in the trash.
If you'd like to learn more about how capitalism has innovated all the joy out of work, I highly recommend you check out.
Good job. Second thought. Another good video. You did it again. I'm proud of you. All right. I have another one on capitalism, actually, that I'd like to watch. This one is, why didn't America accept capitalism? This one's by the Gravel Institute. And I got another Gravel Institute I want to watch after this one, why American education is broken. But I want to watch this one first. Why didn't America adopt socialism? This is with Emma Vigeland from the Majority Report. I like Emma. She's good.
In a lot of ways, America is a strangely right-wing country. No universal health care, no universal child care, poor labor protections. Everyone knows this. But why is that? Well, if you look at American history, you actually find a pretty interesting reason. Unlike other industrialized countries, America never really had a powerful socialist movement. Compare that to Europe. In the 19th and 20th centuries, every country in Europe saw a huge socialist party develop. The Social Democratic Party in Germany, the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, the Socialist Party in Belgium. In countries like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, parties with socialist roots governed for decades. Now, none of these countries ever became fully socialist. Instead, socialist parties and their allies built well-functioning social democratic institutions. It's what they called the European way: universal health care, generous welfare programs, free education, and strong protections for labor. But that's
which would be significant. Now, this is not my vision of what the world should look like either. But it is a point taken that social democratic society, and let's be very clear, it's got tons of limitations that I don't even begin to articulate at this moment. However, it would be a different society if we had more social democratic countries than we do now. Now, is that the path that we necessarily have to go at this point? I don't know.
Sort of transformation never happened in the United States. Now, to be fair, the US did see a fairly strong progressive movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There was the Working Man's Party of the 1870s, the governments of radical reconstruction, which W.E.B. Du Bois called dictatorships of the proletariat, and the leftist Populist Party, which won 5 states in 1892. There were even 2 members of the Socialist Party elected to Congress, and in 1912, Eugene Debs, the socialist presidential candidate, received a full 6% of the national popular vote. The American socialists were successful enough that in 1906, the leader of the German Social Democratic Party predicted that Americans will be the first to usher in a socialist republic.
Wrong.
So why did the American left never gain power like the European left did? There are a few schools of thought about this. The most famous view, that of the German economist Werner Sombart, suggests that Americans were too prosperous and wealthy to believe in socialism. All socialist utopias, he said, came to nothing on roast beef and apple pie. Socialism needed workers to live close together to form working-class institutions. It could do that in places like Berlin or London or Paris, but not so much in sprawling America.
Yeah, so this is an excellent point. The fact that there's always just so much goddamn space in America that people could just fucking move around to. This is exactly right.
Even as the country urbanized in the 20th century, it also suburbanized. Suburban sprawl promoted anonymity and atomization rather than the sense of community and solidarity that socialism needs to take root. Denser places like the Lower East Side of New York, at one point the most densely populated place on Earth, were hubs of socialism and radicalism of all shades. But the vast majority of places weren't like that. And the fact that there was so much land also meant that workers were constantly moving in search of better jobs. As late as the 1960s, about 20% of Americans moved every year. That rate of moving was way higher than in most European countries. And that central struggle, unifying and organizing a disparate working class, was made more difficult by a lot of other problems. Another source of division was occupation. Early attempts to form unifying working class organizations across different levels of skill, like the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, were destroyed by state terror and repression. There were also cultural and political distinctions that made building a party of the working class impossible. The fact that America had universal or near universal male suffrage at a relatively early date, decades before the United Kingdom, prevented voters from polarizing on class lines. That's part of why, in the 19th and 20th centuries, many of the most dedicated socialists in America were Europeans importing socialist traditions from their home countries. It's no surprise that socialism tended to be strongest in immigrant communities, among Germans, Scandinavians, and Finns in the Midwest, and among Jewish immigrants in New York.
And what was used to crush socialism in those days, before you had like the big bad of Russia wasn't that they're just a bunch of like Russian spies or whatever. It's that they're a bunch of immigrants, and we should oppress them for that reason, which still persists to this day. I mean, like, it just sort of like this xenophobia of America is really, really settled in. So there you go.
All of these difficulties in building a broad-reaching socialist coalition were compounded by the structure of American politics. Even today, think about how many times you've seen a friend on social media begging people not to vote third party because it will take away votes from another candidate. And this difficulty was made worse by the brutal repression of socialists. Violence by state troops and private police forces against unions in the 19th and 20th centuries, the first Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, which saw many radicals jailed or deported, and then the second Red Scare of the 1950s, which saw socialists and communists blacklisted and fired. Even now, people who consider themselves communists are banned from immigrating to the United States. But the question isn't really why America never became a socialist country. After all, neither did any of those European countries. The real question is why, after the Democratic Party briefly became a social democratic party in the 1930s and 40s, America has been without any party pushing not just socialism, but any sort of redistribution to help ordinary people. That is the most bizarre absent feature of America. But of course, history...
It's not, because it was intentionally repressed from the get. It was anticipated and repressed by the holders of capital. Essentially, that's the thing that really kind of makes makes the whole thing make sense to me, at least, that it was intentionally repressed by the holders of capital, when specifically the labor movement was basically crushed by essentially, billionaires, the capital holders, the titans of industry, whatever you want to fucking call them. They, after World War II, and this is something Adolf Fried will say as well, after World War II, they were fat and happy. The capital was fat and happy and ready to pounce on the labor movement as soon as the Second World War was over. And it took them, 3 generations essentially, but they did it. They did it.
Isn't destiny. Denied opportunity their whole lives, forced into dead-end jobs, facing mountains of debt and grim prospects, more and more Americans, especially young ones,
and that was contrasted with Europe,
identifying as socialists.
That was contrasted with Europe. Hold on. Stop. That was contrasted with Europe, by the way, where Europe was absolutely, after the Second World War, upended, like just blown the fuck up. And yeah, it's just that, that's the difference. That's one of the, it's not the difference, it's a huge difference here.
Especially young ones, are identifying as socialists. Socialism never took root in America before, but that doesn't mean it can't now. This is Emma Vigeland for the Gravel Institute.
That was a good video. Gravel Institute does some good stuff. They have anything at the end here? No. All right. Let's look at the education one.
For decades, we've heard politicians and the media lambast public schools as failing and broken and denounce the corrupt teachers' unions for protecting lazy and bad teachers. If you look at the statistics, that appears to be the case. You see a story of declining test scores and mediocre student performance. In 2018, the United States performed worse than Lithuania and Vietnam in mathematics on international testing. The antidote prescribed by the establishment experts is simple: privatization, and deregulation. But what if they're wrong? What if the root causes plaguing our public schools are instead poverty, hypersegregation, and chronic disinvestment? What if we examine public schools not as isolated institutions, but within a larger political and economic context that deprives children, families, and their communities of basic livelihoods? In the late 1980s, renowned writer Jonathan Kozol barnstormed the country for 2 years, visiting and documenting his observations in schools in urban and suburban neighborhoods. Reporting from East St. Louis, he noted in his harrowing book, Savage Inequalities, that schools were overcrowded. Children did not have sufficient books, paper, computers, and other resources. Science labs were outdated by a half century. And improper heating made some classrooms freeze and others boil, sometimes reaching 100 degrees. As Kozol put it, one searches for some way to understand why a society as rich and frequently as generous as ours would leave these children in their penury and squalor for so long, and with so little public indignation. Contrary to popular belief, more than a quarter century later, public schools across the United States remain starved of resources. That's because the U.S. is unique in how it funds schools. School funding is determined largely by local property taxes, meaning that wealthy, largely white...
Yeah, this is a great point. Essentially, schools in poor neighborhoods just get starved of funding.
Children are educated in gleaming palaces, while poor, Black, Latino, and Indigenous children are often confined to crumbling schools with crowded classrooms, zero-tolerance discipline, poorly paid teachers and staff, and lack of access to school nurses, librarians, and social workers. Consider a tale of two school systems. In rich, predominantly white Lower Merion, a suburb of Philadelphia, schools spend more than $26,000 per student. And just a few miles away, the diverse Philadelphia schools, which serve predominantly poor and working class children, spend less than $15,000 per student. This is a nationwide phenomenon. In 2016, majority minority school districts received $23 billion less in funding than majority white districts, despite serving the same number of students. This is apartheid-style education. Instead of addressing these inequities, the federal government has doubled down on a market-based approach. Private foundations, think tanks, and both Democratic and Republican officials have fought for a corporate makeover of the public education system. They champion austerity measures, high-stakes standardized testing, school closures, expansion of no-excuses charter schools, a weakening of teachers' unions, and stiff disciplinary methods. This has been the major approach of education reform for the last 2 decades. In 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act, signed into law by President George Bush, with bipartisan approval, imposed stringent testing measures for elementary and middle school students. Those schools that didn't make adequate annual progress risked being labeled as a failing school, having all or parts of its staff fired, shut down, converted into a charter school, taken over by the state, or privatized. Then there was a Race to the Top program, a $4 billion grant competition under the Obama administration. In order to qualify for federal education funding, states were required to adopt an ensemble of policies in their schools, performance-based teacher evaluations.
Oh my God. And we talked about this again yesterday with Rob, the evaluations, the charter schools, all this other shit that just wrecked the American education system, like worse than it already was.
Ensemble of policies in their schools, performance-based teacher evaluations, more standardized tests, more charter schools, and more interventions in failing schools, closures, privatizations, and takeovers. Under the logic of the school reformers, superintendents get called CEOs. Schools in poor communities, especially Black, Latino, and Indigenous ones, are ranked, sanctioned, shut down, and turned over to private management based on student test scores. Teachers are fired and punished based on student performance, and their ratings are sometimes published in newspapers. Segregated charter schools are open.
That's crazy to me. Like, just public shaming of teachers. Unbelievable.
To create an educational free market, to promote competition with public schools. In New York City alone, more than...
That's the capitalist innovation that they were talking about in the Second Thought video. They're innovating it to the point where teachers are just like totally and utterly fucked. Like it's pathetic. It's really pathetic and disgusting.
100,000 students, or 1 in 10 in the city, were homeless. About 34,000 of them came to school from homeless shelters. Millions more children across the US, about 15% of all children, live in poverty. It is one of the highest rates in the industrialized world. That rate is far above the 4% figure in Scandinavian countries. Former Secretary of Education Arne Duncan once said that it is opportunity, not poverty, that shapes children's destiny. But we know the effects of poverty on
opportunity, not poverty, that shapes children's destiny. So essentially, like it's what he's essentially saying is that poverty is no excuse, which is bullshit.
Children, malnutrition, stunted development, mental illness, and low academic achievement. If the corporate school reformers were really committed to making life better for the poorest children in our country, they would stop making such asinine comments and declare, as educator Kenzo Shibata once said, poverty shouldn't be, period. It's not actually that hard to imagine what is necessary.
By the way, I'm going to give my chance an opportunity to plug. Kenzo is hosting his show tonight, Meet the Left, and I will be a guest on there with Jamie Peck and Nomiki Konst, which is exciting. Check it out. It's going to be at 6 p.m. Central Time. That's 7 p.m. for you East Coast losers. And yeah, he's got the topics of discussion up there. Check it out. It's going to be good.
Period. It's not actually that hard to imagine what is necessary to transform the lives of the most vulnerable. It doesn't require more charter schools or more standardized testing. Rather, in line with other countries, we could guarantee an unconditional sum of $250 a month per child per family to pay for diapers, food, clothing, and other childcare costs. This measure alone would cut the child poverty rate by 40% and slash deep poverty in half. It would be the most substantive expansion of the social safety net for children in the modern history of the United States. If we are to guarantee an equitable public education worthy of the dignity of all children, there is no better place to begin than waging an assault on the moral scandal of child poverty in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. I'm Nikhil Goyal, sociologist and PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge for the Gravel Institute.
Let's look at one more, and this is a guy that I actually really like. I think he's a smart dude, Matt Karp, and he did. I'm just subscribed to the Gravel Institute channel, I guess, but I want to watch this one on the Civil War. He wrote a fantastic book, by the way, that everybody should check out, called Our Vast Southern Empire, which goes into a lot of the Southern politics prior to the Civil War, especially like how the South, while it sort of claimed, states' rights or whatever, it claimed it like stood for states' rights and all this other shit, prior to the or in the Civil War, and that's where the reason for their secession was. But what they really were maintaining was they wanted not just to maintain balance in the Senate for essentially to have the break on anything that would overturn the established order of slavery. They were willing to essentially use foreign policy to keep that going, and that's part of when you get expansion of states like Texas and Missouri and Kansas. That's how it sort of played out. Maybe not Kansas, but definitely Missouri and definitely Texas. part of the Mexican-American War was fought in order to bring in slave states, essentially. Really interesting stuff. Yeah, check out his book. But here's Matt.
What do you know about the American Civil War? Just saying these words, the Civil War, probably brings some familiar images to mind. Northern soldiers in Union blue marching against Southern troops in Confederate gray. Epic battles at Shiloh and Gettysburg. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the end of slavery. The victory of the Union over the Confederacy. But there's something else you should know about that era. Something that ties these events together and that you probably didn't learn in school. The Civil War was also America's greatest left-wing revolution. Here's how. In the early 19th century, African slavery was the foundation of social and economic life in the American South. Millions of black workers were owned as property by wealthy planters who denied them education, controlled their family lives, and reaped the fruits of their labor. This system was wildly profitable, and the wealth it produced allowed a tiny elite to dominate Southern and national politics. And before the Civil War, it was expanding all across the Western Hemisphere. In 1860, between the United States, Brazil, and Cuba, there were more enslaved people than ever before. For years, a small group of American abolitionists had denounced slavery as an abomination. These radical activists were scorned by much of society and ignored by both the two mainstream political parties. But in the 1850s, as slaveholders tried to extend slavery across the West, their opponents made a breakthrough. The old two-party system melted down, and the new Republican Party won massive Northern support by opposing slavery's expansion while putting bondage itself on a road to ultimate extinction. The abolitionists broke through, in part, because they named the slave power as the oppressive ruling class that it was. They pointed out that slaveholders were just 1% of the population.
Wow, really? 1% versus 99% rhetoric? That's classic.
But somehow controlled every branch of government. They argued that black bondage was not just morally wrong, but a threat to free labor everywhere. The struggle between anti-slavery and slavery, said Abraham Lincoln, was part of the eternal struggle between the common right of humanity and the divine right of kings. The same spirit that says, you toil and work and earn bread and I'll eat it. It was the common worker, black or white, against the rich. These populist assaults on the ruling class helped Lincoln's party win the election of 1860. Contemporaries called it a political revolution. Its threat to
Bernie Sanders language.
Slaveholders was so serious that they formed their own separate republic, the Confederate States of America. In the Civil War that followed, the stakes were clear. The Union fought against human bondage, for a Democratic majority, and for the dignity of all labor. The Confederacy fought to preserve bondage and elite rule. Confederates fought, as Lincoln told Congress in 1862, to put capital, that's wealth measured in human beings, above labor in the structure of government. Enslaved laborers understood these stakes. Hundreds of thousands fled to Union lines even before emancipation was proclaimed. Radical abolitionists knew it too. Frederick Douglass barnstormed the country, rousing black men to enlist in the Union Army. By war's end, around 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had taken up arms to crush the rebellion. The cause of the Union was the cause of the international left. While conservative aristocrats and capitalists in Europe sympathized with the Confederacy, radicals and labor organizations supported the Union. In 1864, a German journalist named Karl Marx declared that the American anti-slavery war would launch a new era of ascendancy for the working class. Emancipation, as Marx understood.
If only that was true. But it's good that Marx was on the right side of the Civil War. Not surprised.
Was not a middle-class reform project. It was a true social revolution. Only in the United States and in Haiti was emancipation sudden, uncompensated, and enforced by former slaves themselves. That revolution remains incomplete. After the war, former slaves and radical Republicans were defeated by what the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois calls a counter-revolution of property, led by former slaveholders and conservative businessmen. Under the terror of Jim Crow segregation, many of the Civil War's victories for labor and for democracy were rolled back, but not all. The destruction of American chattel slavery was a historic and enduring victory. It meant that black Southerners were able to create the schools and the churches that seeded their later fight against Jim Crow. It radically expanded American democracy and made the modern labor and civil rights movements possible. The Civil War was America's greatest left-wing revolution. Even now, its work remains unfinished. But every left-wing struggle, for the rule of democratic majorities, for the rights of labor over property, and for meaningful freedom and equality, can claim its legacy. I'm Matt Karp, Associate Professor of History at Princeton University for the Gravel Institute.
That's good stuff. That's good stuff.
Thank you for watching this video.
That's great. And we got to get him on the show. But anyway, thank you everybody for watching. I'm going to go ahead and raid Kenzo. But before I do that, make sure tonight you tune in 6 Central on Class Time, his channel, twitch.tv/Class Time. I will be on there with Nomi Keyconst and Jamie Peck on his show, on Kenzo's show, Host the Left. And yeah, we can definitely have a good time. We're going to talk about some fun topics. And yeah, thank you so much for joining the stream. Have a great day. I'm raiding Kenzo. Please hang on for the raid.
Now, okay, so I've laid out exactly why I agree with Lori Lightfoot on this issue. I disagree with this issue for this very important reason, which is the fact that, hey, good morning, Comrade, thanks for the raid. The reason why I oppose it, though, is that what this does is it gives her a tremendous amount of leeway to choose which reporters she talks to. And she's not going to choose the black and brown reporters that are going to ask her the difficult questions. In fact, Gregory Pratt, who's Latino, prominent political journalist in Chicago for the Tribune, she granted him an interview